Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome.
All right. Thank you very much to the physical audience and for the virtual audience for joining us again. We hope you enjoyed the lunch, and we are proceeding with the next session now on metadata and persistent identifiers. We have wonderful speakers lined up, and I'm so thankful to Andrew Joseph from Wits Press, who lined up the speakers for us. I would like to shortly introduce them, and we'll also try in this session to make up for the time that we lost during the previous sessions. So the first speaker would be Alice Meadows. She's the Director of Community Engagement for NISO, the National Information Standards Organization, where she's responsible for engaging with developing the NISO community, including communicating the value of our projects, events, and programs. The next speaker is Brian O'Leary. He's with the Book Industry Study Group, a US-based trade association that disseminates information, creates and implements standards, and conducts research to benefit the book supply chain. The last speaker will be Graham Bell, the Executive Director of EDItEUR, responsible for the overall development of EDItEUR standards and the management services it provides on behalf of other standards agencies, including the International ISNI Agency and the International DOI Foundation. So let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker, Alice Meadows.
Everyone, just share my screen.
I think they've been waiting. Alice?
Yep, can you hear me? Can you hear me in the room, Wikus?
Alice, this is Brian. I can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure whether anybody else can or not, but I'm going to proceed.
Alice, we can see Brian and we can see Graham. Alice, you can proceed with your presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, and you can hear me all right, Wikus?
Just a bit louder in the auditorium, please.
Okay, I'll try and use my outside voice inside. Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Meadows. As Wikus says, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at NISO, and I'm also a co-founder of a small consulting cooperative, both of which are going to come up a little bit in the course of this talk. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to NSBPF for the invitation, and to Andrew in particular. Before starting, I just want to pay my respects to the Indigenous people of Massachusetts and of the town of Brookline, which is where I'm speaking from today. So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions. I'm sure you're all very familiar with both metadata and PIDs, at least to some extent, but just to sort of frame my talk. So this is the Wikipedia, an abbreviated version of the Wikipedia definition of metadata. So it's data about data, basically. It's not the content, it's the data about the data itself. And there's many different forms, and this is not an exhaustive list. And what are persistent identifiers? I'm going to mostly call them PIDs, which is an abbreviation for them. So again, this is the Wikipedia definition of them. So a long-lasting reference to a document, file, web page, or other object. And usually these days, PIDs are not only persistent, but they're actionable. So they resolve. Obviously, there are examples, the ISBN being a notable one, which existed long before the world moved digital, but these days mostly PIDs are resolvable. So PIDs are both an essential component of metadata, but they also have their own associated metadata. And something that I will come back to later is that there are open PIDs, and those open PIDs have open metadata, and there's particular benefits around that. So what does that actually look like? This is a very fun screen grab of some metadata that I pulled from Crossref, actually. And this Crossref is a great example of an open PID registry, which also has open metadata. And what that means is I have nothing to do with Crossref. I'm not a member. I don't pay them anything, but I can still go in and directly from their website or their API, I can grab lots of really useful information. So I've just highlighted a few bits and pieces. You can see who the first author is here at the top of this article. This is an article I wrote some time ago with some colleagues. You can see everybody's ORCID ID. You can see the DOI. I'll talk a little bit more about all of these later. You can see the license. You can see where it's archived in Portico. There's a bunch of very helpful information. And what's particularly important is, of course, it's not terribly nicely laid out for human consumption, but this is the stuff that machines love. So this is all machine readable, which means that it's interoperable. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But first of all, what sorts of PIDs are there? Well, there's basically an identifier for pretty much everything at this point in the research world. So there are PIDs for people. That includes the ORCID, Open Researcher and Contributor ID, and ISNI IDs, International Standard Name Identifier. And I think Graham is going to talk a bit more about those later on. There are PIDs for places, which is things like organizations. So the Research Organization Registry, ROR, Crossref Funder Registry, which is actually being wrapped into the Research Organization Registry over the next year or two. So those two will become one. Ringgold, which I've put in red, and I'll explain that in a minute, which is a proprietary identifier for organizations, and then all sorts of different things. Many things are identified via DOIs, digital object identifiers. Those are used for all sorts of outputs, including data sets, publications, book chapters, images, and those include, the providers for those include organizations like Crossref and DataCite, but several others as well. There are also fairly newly something called RAIDs, Research Activity Identifiers. Those will be used for projects. They're just being used in a very small way at the moment, but are likely to expand. And there's many, many more. There's IGSN's International, I'm going to forget what that stands for, but anyway, for physical objects, and many others as well. So I said I would talk a little bit about open versus proprietary PIDs, and I've done a sort of good, better, best scale here. So there's nothing wrong with proprietary PIDs. There are many of them around. These are persistent identifiers that are basically owned by an organization, usually, but not always a for-profit commercial organization. And mostly they're used by that organization to enable interoperability within the systems for that organization's own systems. But they can be used between systems as well, between other systems as well. The important thing about proprietary PIDs is that in order to be of any value at all, they must resolve to enough information to help determine uniqueness, and they must be able to be shared under a CC0 license so that people can actually access that underlying metadata. Better than proprietary PIDs, in my opinion, are open PIDs, and this means that they have open sort of community governance and they are openly available, including all the metadata. And best of all are FAIR PIDs. So these are PIDs that operate under the FAIR principles, which means they can also be used to discover open, interoperable and well-defined metadata that contains provenance information in a predictable manner. And I'm going to show you some examples of what this means in a minute. So why are PIDs important? I like to think of the power of PIDs. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but persistent identifiers in particularly open persistent identifiers do all of these things. They enable interoperability, they improve discoverability, they increase efficiency, they support recognition, and ultimately, and I think really importantly, they build trust through transparency. So I'll go into a bit more detail about each of those. And I've used, again, I've used mostly sort of ORCID, my own ORCID record and DOIs to demonstrate this, but what I'm saying applies to pretty much every open PID. So this is a snapshot from my ORCID record of the trusted parties, trusted organizations that I have given access to my ORCID record to. And what that means is they can pull any content that I've got in my ORCID record that is not marked private. It's marked private, only I can see it, but anything that's marked public, which for me is pretty much everything, they can get access to it, they can pull it into their systems, they can also update my ORCID record with information in their systems about me. I've granted them that access. You can see here that I can also revoke that access at any time. But for me, I like being able to share my information easily without me having to do anything about it. So that enables interoperability then of my data from my ORCID record can be shared between all those different systems. PIDs also improve discoverability. So here, I like this example, I was experimenting and it worked very nicely. So this is my full name, Alice Jane Meadows. And again, I went into the Crossref interface to do this. And if I just type in my full name, which is, it's not an uncommon name, but it's not super common either. So I get absolutely nothing. Nothing down here is in any way related to me at all. But if I put my ORCID ID in here, everything I get relates to me. So it immediately improves discoverability using my ORCID ID in conjunction with other persistent identifiers, makes my work much more discoverable. PIDs also increased efficiency, and one of the things that we've been working on at MoreBrains is some work with JISC in the UK to look at the value of PIDs as part of some work that they're doing on establishing a national PID strategy. And as part of this, we looked at whether it would be worth their while investing in a national PID consortium, and these are the numbers that we came out at. And what this means is it's not just efficiency in terms of money, and this, by the way, is a very, very conservative estimate. This assumed that metadata only got reused once. And of course, we all know that metadata gets used many, many more times than that. But even just assuming that each bit of metadata attached to a persistent identifier gets used once, savings are close to £6 million over the course of 5 years. But it's not, as I say, just about the money. It's also about the time savings attached. If PIDs were more widely adopted at the national level, it would mean that there are enormous time savings, both for researchers, which is very important, but also for research managers who are doing the reporting and analysis often. PIDs also support recognition. So again, using ORCID as an example here, but there are many others. This is what I have on my ORCID record. Most of it I've added myself. There's an invited positions and distinctions part of the record. There's a membership and service part, but there's also my works, obviously, and my peer review, and those have been added by other organizations. And that's important in part because this displaying the provenance in this way, being able to see where the information comes from, is one really good way of building trust. So you can see, you know, I've added my own information to, as I say, the invited positions and the membership and service, and you can see that the source on both of these is Alice Meadows, but my works and the peer review are added by other organizations. So what that means is you can see that if I haven't added something to myself to my record, if it's been added by somebody else, that adds an extra layer of authority and of verification to that information. And making it transparent means that everybody can see that, and that helps to build trust in this information. So this is a little, it's actually an interactive image, but I'm not sharing it in the interactive version. I think I will share my slides afterwards. So if you're interested, you can go and take a peek at this. But what this demonstrates is how, if these 5 priority PIDs, which is what have been recognised by the UK JISC organisation as the ones that they want to invest in, using how those can be used at each point around the research cycle, from funding, application, right the way through to outputs and to storing this information in repositories, how using each PID sort of helps improve interoperability and efficiency at every stage. There's some links here which I will share in the chat in a minute, so don't worry about those. I just wanted to include them so that you have some more information if you want them. I did want to highlight the Tenet South Africa ORCID Consortium, which has been around for several years now. Before I worked for NISO, I worked at ORCID for about 5 years, and that consortium was set up while I was there, and they do really fantastic work. So if you're not already familiar with them, I highly recommend that you check them out. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you also for highlighting the importance of metadata in increasing accessibility, impact, and citations to publications. And at this point, I also want to mention the wonderful work that Andrew Joseph is doing with the PASA Metadata Working Group on getting South African and scholarly publishers onto the page regarding metadata. The next speaker is Brian O'Leary from the Book Industry Study Group. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you for having me, and good afternoon to everybody. I wanted today to talk about a specific aspect of work that we've been doing. But before I do, I thought it would be useful to spend just a moment explaining the Book Industry Study Group, which is a national organization based in the US, and so probably not familiar to most of the folks gathered, particularly in South Africa. We're an organization that essentially tries to solve problems that affect 2 or more parts of the book business. We're not limited to any one particular area within the industry. So we try to serve as an information hub, providing information to anyone working in book publishing, particularly in the United States. We foster standards that help address many of the issues that Alice has done a really good job of outlining in her talk. We conduct research that shapes the conversation about the current state and potentially the future of book publishing. And finally, we try to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, both within our own organization and across the book industry as a whole. If I had a shorthand, I would say that we're the organization responsible for maintaining the US book industry's plumbing. Plumbing is one of those things that no one thinks about until something goes wrong. And then they think about it quite a bit. And so we work in 5 core areas. These are metadata, rights, subject codes, which is BISAC. It's paralleled by THEMA outside of North America. THEMA is a standard that is managed by Graham Bell's organization, EDItEUR. The supply chain as a whole, that we particularly focus on physical, but also some aspects of digital and workflow. So these are kind of our core topics. We do other work as well, and I'm going to talk about one project in particular. Andrew asked me to talk about our work with respect to the open access supply chain. And what we did specifically was to host a Mellon-funded convening in 2018 that would discuss the challenges of open access ebook usage statistics, essentially analytics. It was part of we were part of a subsequent 2-year Mellon grant that tried to study solutions that would support open access usage data collection and analysis. As part of that second project, that 2-year project, we oversaw a study of the open access supply chain that was conducted by Michael Clark and Laura Ricci of Clark and Esposito. We'd also done a business modeling project that was conducted by Morebrains, the consultancy that Alice mentioned a moment ago. And there's a link here to the full report. And Alice, very smartly, I think you've copied that link and your links and put them in the chat. I'll do the same at the end of this, but I'm also repeating this link in the last slide, so we'll have an opportunity to look at it again. That supply chain study had 5 primary conclusions, and the first of which was that journal-based standards and models are a poor fit for books. So a lot of the metadata work that's been done around open access in particular works for journals, but does not really work for books. I think that's pretty widely understood. In general, monographs are a smaller share of the total distribution of content around the supply chain, but it's also the case that some of the things that make sense for journal articles don't for books, and we need to address that. The second piece is that the existing supply chain is really built for paid access. So open access works are being distributed in an environment where the incentives are really set up for paid access. In some cases, you can think about, for example, if you're using a distributor, that's going to open a number of different questions about how the distributor gets paid. Typically in a paid model, it's a share of the price or some sort of other incentive. That doesn't exist in open access right now, and it's a business model challenge as well. The third piece is that distribution processes themselves are complex and don't easily handle changes to open access status. A number of works might be published early in their lives as part of, for example, a paid journal that converts to, or a paid monograph that then converts to open access. The supply chain in general is not that robust in terms of access to the most current information. And so you need to both provide metadata that indicates that the status has changed, and then follow up on it with the various entities that collect and maintain that metadata across the supply chain. The fourth piece is the standards and best practices that are still being developed for monographs, and some of them are still not sufficient. This is kind of related in part to the first observation about journal-based standards not really fitting. But there's not been a coherent worldwide effort yet to figure out how to handle open access works in a coherent way, particularly with respect to metadata. And because we were working on an analytics project, the large and we think growing number of platforms that deliver open access book information to end users is creating reporting challenges for the industry as a whole. There are a number of both not-for-profit or open platforms like Crossref, as well as for-profit entities in the United States. The examples include EBSCO and ProQuest that are delivering information about open access works. Being able to track that coherently and then to try and resolve it to provide accurate and useful data about how these works are being read and distributed is still a problem that hasn't been solved. I wanted to just end by talking about some of the next steps. The Mellon funded projects continue. There are 2 new grants that have just kicked off, one earlier this year in April, the second in July. That cover separate projects, the July one for data trust and the April one for a set of dashboard services. The business model concerns for both of these entities still have to be sorted out. That's part of what the ongoing Mellon funded projects are hoping to resolve. And I mentioned this link here, which is the access to the supply chain report. It's about a 50-page report, a useful document to read through and give you greater depth on the information I presented today. And as I indicated a minute ago, I will copy that link and put it in the chat so you have easy access to it.
Thank you so much, Brian, for a wonderful presentation. And also highlighting the challenges that the supply chain is facing because of the differences between open access and paid content, and also between books and journals, and how it doesn't often interoperate. The last speaker is Graham Bell from EDItEUR. Graham, thank you. Graham, I think you're on mute. Graham, you're on mute.
Somebody always makes that mistake, and it's often me.
We're hearing you loud and clear.
Thank you to the NSBPF and to Andrew Joseph for the opportunity to participate today. Alice and Brian have given us some great context for our discussion of metadata and identifiers, but I want to stress a couple of things. This metadata, these identifiers, don't exist in some academic vacuum. They aim to, and for their continued success, they must solve real-world problems. Problems that researchers and librarians encounter, problems that booksellers, library suppliers, distributors, and publishers have. And because the management of identifiers, of careful curation of accurate and timely metadata, these things cost time, they cost money. The problems have to be problems that those people are prepared to pay to have solved for them. Thus, there's always a commercial component to both the assignment and the long-term management of identifiers, and to the collection and distribution of metadata. And that's true, whether the books themselves are commercial or non-commercial or open access. Secondly, although we might not always like to think about it this way, our industry is one that produces vast numbers of monographs and of academic journal articles every year. We want to think that every single one of those is an individually polished gem. And each publication individually, to its creators, to its author, to its editor, its publisher, must be incomparable. But for others in the industry, the sheer number of publications necessitates automation and therefore standardization. This is unromantic, even dull. Brian called it the industry plumbing, but it doesn't discount the unique value of each book. That plumbing ensures that every publication has its opportunity. Now, a few words about EDItEUR itself. Our organization, a very small not-for-profit, just 3.5 staff, we develop, support and promote a range of standards for the automated computer-to-computer communication of metadata. Specifically, we're known for the standards called ONIX, THEMA, and EDItEUR. Members of EDItEUR who support us financially, they also get a direct input into the future development of those standards. As a result, our standards are designed from the outset to be applicable globally because our membership is essentially global. It's important to us that EDItEUR standards are made available free for everybody, not just for our members, though. Although most publishers do buy off-the-shelf software to implement our standard, you could, in theory, simply download our specifications and develop your own ONIX or THEMA related software if you wish. Our standards are always about the way your system, whatever that system is, communicates with everybody else's systems, and not how those systems work internally. EDItEUR also supplies management services, as Wikus mentioned earlier, to ISNI and the International DOI Foundation. Until about 5 years ago, we did the same for ISBN as well. 50 years old and certainly the most successful persistent identifier scheme in our industry. Though notably, it's not an open scheme in the way that Alice suggested. I think it was Alice that provided us with a sense of what we mean by metadata. For us, it's all the information about your book. And some of this data is purely internal, and some of the data has to be shared with your supply chain partners. Everybody uses that data, but there's a metadata supply chain stretching from the publisher through the distributors, the retailers, to the libraries, to the retail purchasers, to the market analysts, to the search engines, a metadata supply chain. And ultimately, the metadata supply chain for much of the world, for books, not journals, speaks ONIX. ONIX looks like this. Globally, it's used extremely widely. And that metadata supply chain is largely driven by ONIX. The alternatives are less automatable, less standardized, lots of Excel spreadsheets flying around, relatively inefficient at that. Here's a simple snippet to show you what ONIX looks like, although it's just a very small part of the description of one book. As you can see, ONIX is based around XML as a syntax, and it defines a range of tags like person name inverted for the inverted name of the person. And controlled vocabularies are part of ONIX as well. That A01 code comes from a controlled vocabulary, and it tells you that this contributor is one of the authors of the book or the monograph. ONIX can look relatively simple like this, or it can look much more complicated like this one. But this isn't really that much more complex, it's just more comprehensive. This could appear in the ONIX record for a book by my old professor of geography. It has its departmental and university affiliation, it has a birth date and a birthplace, a Wikipedia reference, and yes, one of those persistent identifiers, in this case, the ISNI. You'll see that ONIX is fairly structured, but it's still relatively flexible in terms of how much information you can include. Let's take a little detour through ISNI. This is one of those international organization for standardization standards. It's a persistent identifier for all types of creators, writers and researchers, but also composers and musicians, stage actresses, visual artists, and so on. It's not limited to the world of books or indeed the world of academia. It is important to realize that the ISNI identifies not a person, but a persona. It's the public identity of the person, their outward face, rather than the person themselves. And ISNIs can also identify corporate entities and fictional characters. Brian's organization, BISG, has an ISNI. Mickey Mouse and Tintin both have ISNIs. It's intended to disambiguate different people whose names appear to be the same, or to co-locate, where maybe a single person uses both their real name and a couple of pseudonyms. ISNI is about 10 years old, but it's picking up impetus all the time. And there's now about 15 million ISNIs assigned and in use and available. 35 odd registration agencies, but a single global registry. And that puts it much more in the camp of modern PIDs rather than old style identifiers like ISBN, which doesn't have a single global registry. You can actually look at that registry and see some of the information about each of the ISNIs. This is it, it's isni.org, and there's a search database option. You'll see here that I've done a search for Kerry Peach, and his name is actually unique in the database, but I'm in there and I'm not a unique name in the database. The 16-digit number you see in the oval is the ISNI itself, and it can also be presented as a URI, something beginning with HTTPS. Now, ISNI is an open PID in the way that Alice highlighted, and the underlying data is available, can be downloaded. Don't, because it's a huge file, but it can be downloaded under an open license and used freely. So back to ONIX, the typical use cases for ONIX are all about communication, communication up and down that supply chain. It supports publisher to distributor or wholesaler, but it also supports publisher to data aggregator, and then aggregator to distributor, wholesaler, retailer, and so on. Sometimes it's used internally to an organization as well. But I think most importantly, it's used globally. There are implementations using ONIX in North America, in virtually every country in Europe, and also in the Asia-Pacific world. It's widely supported by lots of international vendors too. The coverage of metadata in ONIX is pretty wide, and you've got details of which product you're talking about. You've got details of what kind of product it is. How is it packaged? If it's digital, does it have any usage constraints or DRM? If it's open access, you can state what you're allowed to do and what kind of open access this product is. Clearly, it says a lot about titles and authors or contributors, editions and language and so on. That's exactly what you'd expect. But ONIX is importantly much broader than that bibliographic data. It has information that can be used to market products. It has information about the content detail within chapters within products. It has information about the imprint, the publisher, the life cycle dates, and so on. Where in the world can this product be sold, depending on your territorial rights? And finally, it has lots of information about markets and suppliers and prices, because ONIX is overtly a commercial message. But one of the areas that, although ONIX is global and has a very generic set of definitions and use cases, one of the areas that resisted sort of global definition was, what is this book about? Because a few years ago, each country had its own subject scheme. If you were selling a book in Germany, you needed to classify it using a system called WGS, Warengruppen Systematic. If you want to sell your book in the US, you need to use a system called BISG. Well, that latter one is still largely true. We created Thema to be a commercially relevant subject scheme, not just for one country, but a scheme that was intended to be used globally as well as locally. Now, I should say it's optimized for publishers and retailers and not for academic libraries. It could be used in a public library, but it's really not intended to be used in an academic setting. But on the other hand, Thema is multilingual, it's relatively easy to use, it's hugely flexible, and it's available in around 25 languages. One of the easiest ways to quickly see what Thema is about is to look at the website ns.editeur.org/Thema. It's available in lots of languages, I said, and this shows the range of Thema categories that are available. So here you can see the top level, but if I wanted to select a book that was generally about earth sciences or geography, then I could click on that and it would show me subcategories: geography, the environment, regional area planning. Maybe the book is about regional planning, so I can see the subcategories of regional planning, and there are 3 of them there. You'll see on the left-hand side the notation. Those codes, those letters, are what go into your metadata and describe your book to everybody else. So Thema is one element of metadata that was usually communicated inside a much larger ONIX message. Here's an example. Picked a book that may be of relevance to some of you, and we have suggested some of the Thema codes that might be relevant to this particular book. And I would actually highlight that last one, GTS, because that's one of the first visible outcomes of the interaction that EDItEUR has had with PASA, with Andrew Joseph, with others in South Africa, because that's a code that's been newly added over the past 6 months or so, from when we were first talking about it. Now it is part of the Thema standard and could be used by anybody on relevant books. Now, that's a very quick overview of ONIX, Thema, and ISNI. They're highly practical standards for metadata and identification. They're used across a broad swathe of the global book trade. I think now I'll hand back to Wikus, who will lead the discussion.
Thank you so much, Graham. We really appreciate it. It's also important in this presentation to see that metadata enables automation, firstly, and standardization, and how important it is for publishers to implement best practices when using metadata in order to ensure that information is universally findable, discoverable, and so that people can use it in the end. I will give a chance for one physical question from the audience and then one virtual question. Is that all right? So start.
I'm looking at Andrew. He posted a question. So please, Andrew, over to you to please ask the question.
2 in 1.
Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like everyone's going, oh no, it's him again. Excuse me. I thank you very much for the presentation, all of you, and Wikus for sharing that. I think the question that I had comes from the discussions we had earlier, which was about ascribing value to the titles that are published, particularly by scholarly presses, and to be able to say that this has been peer reviewed, for instance, or you know, if there's useful information that can find its way back to funders, back to administrative departments and institutions. So specifically, I wanted to know if there was a way or a plan or anything about peer review assessments being included in something like Onyx, and could that then feed back to the institutions through RAWs or through ORCIDs for the individual researchers?
It probably makes sense for me to answer that one, Wikus. So I'll say, Andrew, great question. You can in Onyx, if there's a monograph you're describing in Onyx, you can say this monograph has been peer reviewed. Of course, you can't say who the peers are, but peer reviewer is one of those roles, but it can be used only with anonymous contributors. So yes, you can say it's been peer reviewed. You can also make direct links between contributors and funders and who has paid for the research and that sort of thing. There's enough room in Onyx for all of those things already. You can also describe particular monographs as being open access. You can link to their licenses. Again, you can say who the funders of the publication are, and you can say quite a lot about what you might call the business model of the open access, how it is made open and how it's distributed. Hope that answers your question.
Alice, and I'd also want to ask from you, the information on peer review in your org ID, did it come from Publons or which platform?
I believe in that case it came directly from F1000 Research, which is who I did the review for. And I was going to thank you, Wikus, for the opportunity, because I was just going to follow on from what you said, Graham. I believe at the moment there aren't any examples of peer reviews of books in the ORCID record. So how ORCID works is that's the peer review section is one of the parts that you have to have added by a third party. You can't add your own review activity because obviously there would be a kind of weird conflict of interest type thing going on there. So it has to be added by a third party. I know a number of journals publishers are using it either directly, as you say, Wikus, through Publons or through directly from the publisher itself via their manuscript submission system. If people are sharing book peer reviews with Publons, then yes, they absolutely can be pushed through to the ORCID record from Publons. I just am not aware that that's happening, but if it is, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, Susan?
Thank you, Chair. No, there's no questions from the floor any longer or from online. Perhaps just a comment from me. I would just want to thank the three previous speakers, you know, from the Academy of Sciences lens. We push standards quite a bit within journal publishing, but not so much in book publishing. So just want to urge Joseph and his team that we also in USAF also have a look at these standards. I find that metadata fields are very powerful, and I like the sort of the distinguishing sort of factor that you've factored in. Sorry, and I can't remember which speaker that says it speaks about persona, not the person. And I think that's very important, is that we start bringing in that persona sort of side of things, because that will make the books far more discoverable, and also then tapping into international standards, etc. So I think there's quite a bit of work for us to do in this field, and I'm looking forward to it, and I'm very excited about what has been shared with us today. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much again for the speakers. Thank you for USAF, Susan, Maputi, for arranging this. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.